This video is brought to you by patreon.com/worsttake. Get access to exclusive live streams and Discord servers, on-screen shoutouts, and early access to some videos when you join now. Help make sure that we can continue to make content like this by supporting the Patreon. Links are in the description down below. Now, a lot of people want to talk about Joe Flacco versus DTR, who should start for the rest of the season. And here's where I'll give my piece on this whole conversation, because it seems like people in the chat seem to want to talk about this. I think that this is a conversation that's getting harder and harder to have because people are using Joe Flacco for arguments that don't really involve Joe Flacco, right? Like, just from what I've seen and the people talking about him, it feels real Josh Dobbsy, where people are pumping up what he's done just to kind of stick it and make a point about something that they don't like about this team. And for some people, they're like, we don't want DTR, we're Joe Flacco, this is why. And some people are like that with Deshaun. It's just very weird, the whole environment around Joe Flacco. Here's why I think the situation is. I think Joe Flacco played well on Sunday, for the most part. I think he really fell apart after that interception, but he played well for like 3 quarters in that game, or played well enough for like 3 quarters, right? It was very Jacoby Brissett-ish, in the same way that Jacoby kind of made some of these throws, and you're like, great throw, Jacoby. In the same way that Jacoby wasn't really the most athletic guy back there. So when the pocket collapsed on him, he didn't really have that many options. And in the same way that we knew, hey, if we push Jacoby past 35 attempts, it can start to get ugly. And once you got Joe Flacco up above 40 attempts, it started to get ugly. And it wasn't just the interception. It was the ensuing possession after that. And it was the safety after that. It was how that game ended. Those last 3 possessions were awful. He was not good in those last 3 possessions. I know some people want to blame that interception on coaching. That's just not how that ever works. Joe Flacco had a choice to throw that ball deep. He threw that ball deep. He was late. He knew it. He said it in his press conference. It was a horrible decision for him to do. So he shouldn't have done it. Even if the call was like, hey, look at that. But the call has things in place to tell you, if you see this, don't take it. He saw that, still took the deep shot, was a bad throw. So I'm trying to look at this Joe Flacco thing with all of the angles possible. There was some really good stuff. There was some stuff that made me concerned. And then you have to look at the other picture with Joe Flacco, is that he is 38 years old. And the reason I bring up that he's 38 years old is, one, this offensive line is not good. Joe Flacco took a ton of hits yesterday. He took a ton of hits. He's 38 years old. I know people like to tell me Tom Brady played till he was 40, that Drew Brees played forever, that Brett Favre played till he was 40, that Peyton Manning played with a broke neck until he was 40. That's cool. Joe Flacco's never been on the level of any of those guys. I feel like we're forgetting that we're elevating who Joe Flacco was a bit too much. Joe Flacco was always known as somebody who had a good run in 2013, never quite lived up to that run after that. He's been chasing that same dragon of 2012, 2013 for like 10 years. He's also been somebody who's known for not being the greatest quarterback in clutch situations. He's also been known as a quarterback who makes the biggest mistakes, usually in the 4th quarter. He's not changed. He's still Joe Flacco. And I get it, after watching PJ Walker in Denver, people are like, Joe Flacco seems like a god, right? Rightfully so. But it doesn't mean that Joe Flacco isn't who Joe Flacco is. I say all of that to say he's still useful. I just think his use is limited. And when I say limited, I don't mean by what he can do on the field. I mean limited in the aspect of, I think Joe Flacco can only give you a certain amount of good reps right now. Like, I think Joe Flacco at this point is good for like 80 to 100 dropbacks. If you push him past that in a season, you're going to get some bad performances. This happened last year when he was 37 with the New York Jets. Had a couple good games. We saw one in Cleveland, threw 4 touchdowns against us in Cleveland. Next game, he was awful. They put him on the bench. He didn't play again until later in the season. Things didn't really change after that. Older players can be out there lesser amount of times unless they are outliers. He is not an outlier. He's never been an outlier. So at 38, I see him as somebody who can give you a certain amount of dropbacks. He can give you about 80 to 100. But once you push him past that, he's done. He's an older car. He has a lot of miles on him. You got to use that accordingly. I don't think the drop off between him and DTR is that significant. I think DTR, given more time, more experience in his offense, can look very similar to what Joe Flacco did on Sunday. And I also think that he adds a dimension to this passing attack, which is he can run. And again, the offensive line isn't good. You probably need somebody who's a little mobile out there so he can make something out of nothing. Now, again, if Joe needs to get back in there, Joe's a perfect candidate to get back in there. I think for the situation that the Browns are in, they have the best quarterback scenario that they can hope for. I think Joe Flacco's fine for those 100 snaps, and he's not at 100 yet. And I think that DTR can be fine if you give him time. And I thought he was fine the last time he played against Denver. So quarterback-wise, shockingly enough, I don't think that's your problem going forward with this team, is who's playing quarterback. I think, honestly, that's the least of your problems. I can see a world where you can win those 3 games or more with Joe Flacco. I can see a world where you can win those 3 games or more with DTR. I would rather go with DTR because he's younger, more athletic, and you can always go back to Joe if DTR kind of flames out, right? If he flames out, you can always go back to Joe. But I don't think it's the same vice versa. I don't think you can always go back to DTR if you bench him. So that's why I would rather go with DTR. You got to look at the big picture with this. You got to look at how many reps can you really realistically expect from Joe Flacco at this point, right? He's not necessarily a full-time starter. I don't think anybody thinks that Joe Flacco is still a full-time starter at this point of his career. So how many snaps do you think he's good for? My bet, about 80 to 100, similar to what it was with him with New York last year. So that's what I think about that whole situation. But again, I don't think that's the biggest problem that the Browns have. The biggest problem that the Browns have had is consistency with the defense on the road. The biggest problem that the Browns have had has, in the last 2 weeks, has been their lack of ability to get pressure. But that brings us back to the original question. Are the Browns a playoff team? And what does that mean? Do they feel like a playoff team? And do they make the playoffs? Are those two the same thing? Is it possible to make the playoffs and not feel like a playoff team? I think it's very possible to make the playoffs and not feel like a playoff team. I think teams do it every year. Pittsburgh, when they made the playoffs in 2021, they made the playoffs. They didn't feel like a playoff team. They got ran by the Chiefs. Forgettable. Nobody talks about that playoff appearance. Is that good? Honestly, for the Browns right now, I see no reason not to make the playoffs. It's not like you own a first-round pick and somebody else owns your first-round pick, so it really doesn't benefit you at all to not make the playoffs, so why not? But that's a question for the fans, because it's one thing if we feel like a playoff team going into the playoffs. It's another thing if we don't. Now, I'm going to ask this question, this first poll, and the question is, who do you think needs to step up the most to make the playoffs? Now, I have 4 candidates for people who need to step up the most to make the playoffs. There's the Browns defensive line. There's the Browns quarterback. There's the Browns secondary. There's the Browns run game. Now, I'll make the argument for each one as people select. The Browns defensive line. Are they the one that needs to step up? I think you can make a very strong argument for the Browns defensive line being the part of the football team that needs to step up the most. Look, they're the most elite part of this defense. I think this team, not just the defense, this team is all about the defensive line. When this defensive line is playing great, it don't matter who playing quarterback, we look great. We done had this feeling with PJ Walker. We done had this feeling with DTR. We done had this feeling. Well, we might have this feeling with Joe Flacco. And we've had it certainly with Deshaun. When the defensive line's playing great, this team looks amazing. They play complementary football and they flat out win football games. When the Browns are able to reset this offensive line, when they're able to reset the line of scrimmage, when they're able to do the elite defensive line stuff that they were doing, they're one of the best teams. Look at the two wins that the Browns have, the two most impressive wins that the Browns have. They have beaten the 49ers, who look like the best team in the NFC, and the Baltimore Ravens, who you can make the argument right now is the best team in the AFC. They've beaten those two teams off of strong defensive line performances. When the defensive line's good, this team is really hard to beat. It don't matter who's at quarterback, who's there, who's not. This team's really hard to beat. Now, Browns quarterback situation. What I will say is when the Browns quarterback situation has been right this year, basically the 4 starts you've gotten with Deshaun Watson, you've had the highest point differential that you've had all year. You win easier when your quarterback's playing well. If the Browns have quarterback play that's a little bit better, win-loss record probably looks a little bit different. It's the most important position in all of sports. And if you can get a playmaker type performance from the Browns quarterback going forward, whoever that may be, that could change a lot of things. Quarterback play masks a lot of errors. So that's in there. The secondary. A lot of people thinking that Denzel Ward being out these last 2 weeks have been what's hurt this team the most. Secondary is a little leaky. It allows teams to just get rid of the ball quickly. Maybe that's starting to hurt the pass rush. Maybe Denzel Ward is hurting the defensive line more than the defensive line is hurting Denzel Ward. A lot of that run stuff on the boundary. That happens when Denzel Ward's not in the game. When Denzel Ward's in there, he usually makes that tackle. He's a good player in run fit. So maybe the secondary has something to do or a lot to do with the Browns' inability to stop the run. It's a question to be asked. You don't really think about corners when it comes to not being able to stop the run, but it's certainly something that happens. In the Browns' run game, hey, look, if you can't rely on your quarterbacks, you want to be able to rely on running the ball. And that's what Nick Chubb's been so great for, is that, hey, look, the quarterback play might be what it is, but we're going to be able to run that ball with Nick Chubb. They might stack the box with 8-9 people. We still going to be able to run that ball with Nick Chubb. Browns don't have that anymore. If that can develop for them, or something similar to that can develop for them, they'd be in a great place. But who do you think needs to step up the most for the Browns to not just make the playoffs? Because we know that the Browns can make the playoffs. As we'll get to the playoff predictor in a minute here. We know the Browns can make the playoffs. But to feel like a playoff team. Some people are saying they need to use Pierre Strong. Some people say the pass interference calls are killing us. Some people are saying we need Denzel Ward. Some people are saying you better vote for that defensive line. Right now, the defensive line is winning that vote. Now, let's talk about what needs to happen for this team going forward. So this is what I want to ask here before I get into the playoff machine. How many of these games do you guys think that the Browns will win going forward? Do you think the Browns turn it around and win all 5 of these games to end the year? Do you think the Browns win the 3 of those games that we talked about, the Bears, the Jets, and what's the other game? The Bears, the Jets, and the Bengals. Yes. So do you think the Browns win those games? That's very likely that the Browns win those games. Or do you think the Browns find a way to make an upset? I will say this. You do play two tough teams, two playoff teams, the Texans and the Jaguars. I do think those are the two teams you can probably get in this situation, though, that would be in the playoffs in the AFC. The Texans, if you've watched them closely, like I know a lot of people have watched the Texans from afar and all they hear is the good news from CJ Stroud and all this stuff about how the Texans are this fireball of a team. But if you watch the Texans closely, you would know that that's not necessarily the case. They just lost Tank Dell for the year. CJ Stroud missed part of the game with an injury, so we don't know what that's going to be going forward. And while that defense is good, they're still a very young defense, and you can get to them. And they've been playing some closer games than you would anticipate that the Texans are should play. They've dropped some games that you felt like they shouldn't have dropped. They're not an unbeatable team. The Jaguars are a very inconsistent team. This is why I say, if the defense plays elite, you have a chance to beat the Jaguars. Because I don't believe the Jaguars to be an elite team. I believe them to be a good team, but if you put elite pressure on them, I think they fold. So if the defense shows up next week, I think they turn the ball over. I think they can fold. Now, do the Browns win all of those games? Probably not. Can they win 4 of those games? Maybe. Will they win 3 of them? I don't know. This Browns defense really needs to step it up. It's about who we see for the rest of the year. Keep in mind that of these last 5 games, I believe 2 of them are at home. No, 3 of them are at home. So you get the Bears at home, you get the Bengals at home, and you get the Jaguars at home. You will have to win a Bengals game on the road. That's also something to consider. Most of us think that the Browns will win 3 of them. And I will make this point. If the Browns win 3 games, they will make the playoffs. But I'm willing to bet money that in a month or whenever the playoffs start, like in January, if that's how the Browns get into the playoffs, I know what Browns fans going to be like. I've been doing this job long enough to know. I've been doing this job long enough to know. If they get to the playoffs like that, we aren't going to feel like a playoff team. But one win can make that different. And I think if you do get a win versus the Texans or you do get a win versus the Jaguars, you will feel like a playoff team. I don't even think it changes your positioning that much, to be honest with you. I just think it changes how we feel about that positioning, which is a lot, right? Like that matters a lot to people, how you feel about that position.